The crowded market bustled with voices and footsteps, but one small figure went unnoticed. Hidden in the shadow of a produce stall, a young girl, no older than 7, huddled with her knees pulled tight against her chest, her small hands gripping a well-worn stuffed bear. She hadn't moved much in days, and her gaze held a deep, unspoken fear that somehow made her look far older than her years. Her hair was matted, her clothes worn thin, and every so often she flinched as strangers passed a bit too close. The sun had barely touched the horizon when Mr. Holden arrived at his modest fruit stall, his weathered face showing signs of another sleepless night. He moved with the calm, methodical manner of someone who had lived through his share of hardships, the kind that never quite faded but left a quiet resilience behind. Widowed and alone, his days followed a simple rhythm: early mornings, hours of small talk with customers, and solitary evenings in his modest home. Yet, as he bent down to arrange a box of apples, his gaze landed on the girl. Mr. Holden paused, his brows knitting together. She was there again, just as she had been the day before, and the day before that. He'd noticed her from a distance, but assumed she belonged to one of the vendors. This time, he saw the hollowness in her eyes, a look that struck a chord deep within him. Something told him she didn't belong to anyone here. He crouched down, holding out an apple. "Hey there, kiddo," he said gently. "You hungry?" She didn't answer, but her eyes darted to the apple, then back to him. She was hesitant, wary, but hunger won out. She reached for it, and he noticed how small her hands were, how thin her arms seemed beneath her worn-out sweater. As she bit into the apple, he asked, "What's your name?" She glanced away, her silence speaking louder than any word. He realized then that whatever had brought this child to the market had left a mark on her, one that wouldn't fade with a few kind gestures. In the days that followed, Mr. Holden couldn't keep himself from watching over the girl. She never spoke, never wandered far from his stall, but each morning she was there, her eyes wary yet watchful, as if waiting for something or someone. Her presence stirred something in Mr. Holden, something he hadn't felt in years. The routine of his life was unchanging, each day blending into the next. Yet now he found himself anticipating his trips to the market with a strange mixture of worry and protectiveness. One morning, after handing her a small sandwich wrapped in a napkin, he couldn't help but ask, "Is there anyone looking for you, kid?" The girl's head lowered, and for the first time, her voice, soft and cracked, slipped out. "No." The word hung in the air, almost a confession, and Mr. Holden's heart twisted. He wanted to know more, but sensed that pushing would only drive her back into silence. So instead, he tried something else, offering her a job of sorts. "How about you help me with these crates?" he suggested, gesturing to a pile of apples ready to be stacked. "I could use an extra pair of hands and you'll earn yourself a snack." Her eyes lit up ever so slightly, and with a shy nod, she took her place beside him. Together, they worked in quiet companionship. With each day, the girl's presence felt less like a chance encounter and more like a part of his routine. He even began bringing small blankets and spare clothes for her to use, pretending not to notice when she accepted them with silent gratitude. But Mr. Holden wasn't the only one noticing her. One afternoon, his old friend, Officer Grant, came by the stall, tipping his hat with a friendly grin. Grant was a sturdy man with a warm, booming laugh that could light up a room. They'd known each other since their school days, but the war had taken them down different roads. Grant had found stability in his police work, while Holden had returned with scars both visible and unseen. Grant's gaze fell on the girl, and he arched a brow. "New helper?" he asked, his tone casual, but his curiosity evident. Mr. Holden hesitated, glancing at the girl before answering. "She's just around here. Seems like she doesn't have anyone." Grant's expression grew serious. "You know anything about her? Name? Where she's from?" Holden shook his head. "She barely says a word. All I know is she doesn't have anyone looking for her." Grant sighed, crossing his arms. "Kids like that don't just wander off, Holden. You want me to look into it?" Holden's hand tightened around an apple as he considered. Part of him wanted answers, but another part feared what they might reveal. Finally, he nodded. "Just find out what you can." "Don't scare her," Grant agreed, and as he left, Holden felt a sense of dread creeping in. What if she was on the run? What if there was more danger lurking behind those quiet eyes than he realized? The questions nagged at him, but each time he looked at her, he pushed them aside, focusing instead on the simple joy of her company. Then, one evening as the market closed, the girl surprised him. Tugging gently at his sleeve, she looked up, her eyes filled with something between hope and fear. "My name, it's Lily," she whispered, as if revealing a long-kept secret. He smiled, her name settling in his heart like an old melody. "Well, Lily, you're welcome to stay as long as you need." But just as he thought they were settling into a peaceful routine, a tall, thin woman with a nervous energy appeared at the market a few days later. Her eyes darted from stall to stall, her face contorted with worry. She spotted Lily by Holden's side and immediately rushed over, her voice trembling as she called out, "Lily, there you are! I've been searching for you everywhere!" Holden felt his chest tighten as the woman reached for the girl, pulling her into a tight hug. Lily's expression turned blank, her face drained of the light it had carried in recent days. She didn't resist, but Holden could see that she wasn't comforted by the woman's touch. The woman looked up, her eyes meeting Holden's with a mixture of relief and suspicion. "Thank you for keeping her safe. She wandered off when we were shopping, and I couldn't find her," she explained hastily, a nervous laugh slipping out. Holden's instincts told him something wasn't right, but he forced a polite nod. "Glad she's all right," he murmured, his tone cautious. Lily didn't say goodbye. She simply allowed herself to be led away, her eyes downcast, her small figure disappearing into the crowd with the strange woman. Holden watched, a sense of unease gnawing at him, but he pushed it aside, telling himself that he'd done the right thing. The market felt colder the next day, emptier. Each time a small figure passed by, his heart skipped, only to settle back into disappointment. Days turned into a week, and he tried to forget, but the thought of Lily haunted him. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw her face, the quiet strength in her eyes, and something else, an unspoken fear. Then, one evening, as he was locking up his stall, his phone buzzed. It was a message from Grant, short and ominous. "Need to talk. Call me." He called back immediately, his heart pounding as Grant's voice came over the line, tense and urgent. "Holden, that girl you told me about, Lily. We've got a problem." "What problem?" Holden's voice was barely a whisper. Grant hesitated, his voice weighted with concern. "That woman you saw her with? She's not her mother. She's part of a group known for taking in kids, making them beg. I'm sorry, Holden, but this is serious. We need to find her." Holden's grip on the phone tightened as rage and fear surged within him. He'd failed Lily once by letting her go. Now he had to make things right. The hunt for Lily had begun. The night seemed to press down on him as Mr. Holden sped through the streets, his old pickup rattling with every bump in the road. Grant had given him the last known locations where the so-called family of beggars had been seen. Small encampments scattered along the city's outskirts. Mr. Holden's heart hammered with the urgency of someone who knew he was running out of time. He couldn't let her slip through his fingers again. The first stop was a desolate underpass filled with makeshift tents and abandoned shopping carts. Shadows flickered beneath the dim streetlights, and Mr. Holden could feel dozens of wary eyes on him as he parked and got out. Most people averted their gazes, unwilling to engage with a stranger, but one woman, older, with a face weathered from years of hardship, lingered nearby, her gaze wary but curious. "Excuse me, ma'am," he began, his voice rougher than he'd intended. "I'm looking for a little girl, maybe 7, goes by Lily. Seen her around here?" The woman's eyes softened as she studied him, sensing the urgency in his voice. "Maybe I have," she replied cautiously, glancing down the road. "But if she's with them, you're going to have a hard time getting her out." Mr. Holden's throat tightened. "Where can I find them?" She pointed down the alley, a place known as the Block among those living on the streets, a last resort for those with nowhere else to go. He thanked her, pushing forward. His mind focused on one thing: finding Lily before it was too late. As he approached the block, he noticed a cluster of people sitting around a fire. Children sat scattered among them, some half asleep, others looking lost, their faces shadowed with a weariness that seemed too heavy for their years. And there, at the edge of the firelight, he saw her, Lily. She was sitting alone, clutching her stuffed bear, her face a mask of silence. She hadn't noticed him yet, her gaze distant, as if she were in another world. But the moment she glanced up, their eyes met, and a flicker of recognition passed across her face. Her lips parted in surprise, but before she could react, a thin, bony hand clamped down on her shoulder. It was the woman who'd claimed to be her mother, her face now twisted with a mix of anger and fear. "What do you think you're doing here?" she hissed at Mr. Holden, her grip on Lily tightening. "She's mine." Mr. Holden stepped forward, his voice low but filled with unshakable determination. "Let her go. She doesn't belong to you." The woman's eyes narrowed, and for a tense moment it felt as if the entire world held its breath. "And what makes you think you can just take her?" she sneered. "Who are you to her?" A question lingered in the air, unanswered, but Mr. Holden knew the answer. He was the one who cared for her when no one else did. He was the one who saw her pain, the one who refused to let her slip through the cracks. Someone who actually gives a damn. He replied firmly, his voice carrying a weight that silenced even the woman. For a moment, the woman looked as if she might lash out. But then something shifted in her expression. She glanced around, realizing that eyes were on her. Not just Mr. Holden's, but those of others in the camp. People who had grown tired of her ways, who had seen enough suffering. She released Lily with a bitter curse, stepping back and disappearing into the shadows as quickly as she'd arrived. Mr. Holden rushed forward, dropping to his knees as he took Lily's hands in his. "You're all right now," he whispered, his voice trembling. "You're safe." But the ordeal wasn't over.
Hey there, quick message. Grab a paper, write down HeroKind Stories, our channel name. Come back soon, we've got incredible stories you won't want to miss.
Just as they turned to leave, a police car pulled up, lights flashing. Grant stepped out, his expression a mixture of relief and anger. "Holden, what were you thinking? Charging in here like that? You could have gotten yourself hurt, or worse." Holden straightened, his hand firmly holding onto Lily's. "I couldn't just leave her, Grant. She needed someone to be there for her." Grant sighed, rubbing his temple. "Well, you're lucky. We had an eye on this group, but we hadn't made our move yet. Now we'll finally be able to get these kids somewhere safe." Lily looked up at Holden, her small hand gripping his tightly, her eyes filled with gratitude and something more, a glimmer of trust. He realized then that this wasn't just about rescuing her from one dangerous situation. It was about being there for her from here on out. "Let's go home, Lily," he said gently, guiding her toward his truck. But as they reached the truck, Lily hesitated, her gaze drifting back to the others still by the fire, the children whose faces mirrored her own pain. She tugged on his sleeve. "What about them?" Holden's heart sank, his eyes following hers to the children left behind. Grant, noticing the exchange, gave a nod. "We'll get them help too, kiddo," he promised. "Tonight, no one's being left alone." With that reassurance, Lily allowed herself to be led into the truck, her eyes fluttering closed as soon as she felt the warmth of the seat. Holden glanced at her through the rearview mirror, a sense of relief flooding over him. As they drove away from the market, the reality of what had just happened began to sink in. The quiet bond they'd formed in the days before had transformed into something far deeper, something unbreakable. He didn't know what the future held, but he knew one thing for certain. He'd be there for Lily, through every hardship, through every fear, as long as she needed him. The drive was silent, but full of a promise, one that needed no words. Weeks passed, and as the days turned into a quiet rhythm, Lily began to settle into life with Mr. Holden. The small home he'd known only as a place of solitude and memory started to fill with new sounds. Her laughter, her footsteps as she explored each corner, her voice as she asked him questions about the world. She was still a little wary, especially around strangers, but with Mr. Holden, her eyes gradually lost their guarded look. She was learning, slowly but surely, what it meant to be safe. One Saturday morning, Mr. Holden found himself standing in the kitchen, scratching his head as he stared at an empty bowl. Lily had mentioned pancakes, and though cooking wasn't exactly his strong suit, he wanted to give it a try. He hadn't realized how much he'd missed the simple joy of making breakfast for someone else, of watching as Lily's eyes lit up at the sight of the pancake stack he'd somehow managed to create. She laughed as he placed the somewhat lopsided pancakes in front of her, and he couldn't help but smile. It was a slow, steady kind of happiness, the kind he hadn't expected at this stage in his life. But as the weeks rolled on, he found himself becoming less of the solitary figure he'd once been and more like a father, protective, patient, and hopeful. One day, a knock at the door interrupted their breakfast. Mr. Holden opened it to find Grant standing there, a warm smile on his face, though his eyes held a hint of something serious. "Mind if I come in?" he asked, nodding toward Lily, who was peeking out from behind the kitchen counter. Grant sat down, glancing between the two of them. "Holden," he began, "we've done some digging and, well, we wanted to talk about Lily's future." The mention of her name brought her closer, her hand instinctively finding Mr. Holden's. She looked up at him, her eyes wide and anxious, and he gave her a reassuring squeeze. Grant cleared his throat. "There's no one else, Holden. No other family, no relatives who could take her in." He paused, his gaze resting on Mr. Holden. "So, if you're open to it, we'd like to talk about making this arrangement permanent." The words hung in the air, and for a moment Mr. Holden felt as though he'd been given a second chance. A chance to make up for the family he'd lost, to offer Lily the life she deserved. He glanced down at her, her face filled with a quiet hope, as if she were afraid to believe it could be true. "I'd like that," he said, his voice choked with emotion. "I'd like that very much." The weeks that followed were filled with paperwork, meetings, and home visits, all of which Mr. Holden endured with a patience he hadn't known he possessed. Each step brought them closer to becoming a real family, and with each hurdle they crossed, he felt his heart settle deeper into the role he had grown to cherish. One evening, after a particularly long day, Lily curled up next to him on the couch, her head resting against his shoulder. She was quiet, lost in thought, until finally, she whispered, "Are you my dad now?" The question struck him with a warmth that spread through every corner of his heart. He wrapped an arm around her, pulling her close. "Yes, Lily. If you want me to be, then yes. I'm your dad." Her hand reached up to clutch his, and she nodded, her face breaking into a smile. It was a smile he'd come to know well, one that was rare and precious, like sunlight after a storm. And in that moment, he knew he'd found something he never expected: purpose, family, and the quiet but profound joy of knowing he'd changed her life, and that she'd changed his just as deeply. As they sat together, the house now full of laughter and warmth, Mr. Holden thought back to the day he'd first seen her in the market, a small figure hiding in the shadows. He knew that, despite the hardships, they had found their way to each other, and that together they'd weather whatever storms lay ahead. "Hey, kiddo," he murmured, glancing at her with a soft smile. "How about we make pancakes again tomorrow?" She laughed, her eyes sparkling. "Only if you promise not to burn them this time." They both laughed, and in the quiet peace of that evening, the past felt like a distant memory. They were a family now, a small, imperfect family, bound not by blood, but by something far stronger: love, resilience, and the promise of a better tomorrow. Thank you for watching HeroKind Stories. If you enjoyed this story of love and resilience, please consider subscribing and sharing it with others who would love this heartfelt tale. And don't go just yet. Another incredible story is waiting for you just a click away. Tap the video on your screen now.